His name is Booster Gold. It's his first day at Sanctuary. And everyone's dead. And that's it. That's pretty much everything that happens in this issue. Don't know why we needed 22 pages to tell that story, but here we go! The number one worst story as decided by our fans from 2018 is Heroes in Crisis. So I have mixed feelings on this one. On the one hand, I really don't like this series. I don't like where it's going. I don't think it's lived up to its promise of dealing with superheroes afflicted with mental health issues in an interesting way. I think that at some point from when that was first advertised as what Heroes for Crisis was going to be about, things changed, and we were left with this hollowed out mess of a series. On the other hand, I don't love the fact that this won, and won in a landslide, even though we're really only covering 3 issues, the 3 that had come out in 2018. But to be fair, even if we lump in issues 4 and 5, which came out this year, this comic is still awful. One of the worst crossover events I've ever read. Like Batman, I expect this particular result is going to cause a bit of controversy with people. Although I will point out not a single person in any of the best of voting voted for this being one of the best of stories of the year. I can't say the same about Tom King's Batman series. But as for Heroes of Crisis, written by Tom King and with artwork by Clay Mann and a bunch of other people, the story's a little bit different here. I think there's less of an argument for this series. I think this contradicts what I said, that he might be better at limited series, because this limited series is terrible. And getting into why might be a little difficult, because it's something that I've noticed a lot of other critics and reviewers have picked up on, but a lot of fans of this series seem to miss. And that's when you kind of strip away all the fanciful dialogue, all the weird time jumping and non-linear storytelling of this series, all the fancy tricks and gimmicks, we're left with a series that is fundamentally empty. Empty is the perfect word to describe Tom King's storytelling style in this mini-series. Devoid of any depth to it. Written with a lot of ambiguity and with an appearance of nuance, but again, like if you break down everything that happens in issue 3, there's just a lot of talk and gimmicks and little jokes, and very little told in the story other than what I said in the recap. We find out that Booster went to this sanctuary place as sort of treatment center for superheroes, and then Harley Quinn showed up and everybody died. And that's it. It's actually remarkable. This sort of storytelling is a bit of a problem in modern comics, and we do see it in other series, especially in certain comic book events. A whole issue dedicated to a lot of build-up and hype, but very little actual storytelling being achieved, especially compared to what I have seen so many other comic book stories and even little events like this do in a single issue. A good writer can put a lot of plot into a very small amount of space. Grant Morrison's actually a great example of this because he writes in this ambiguous style of narrative that is present in Heroes in Crisis, but if you strip away all the fancy writing techniques of Grant Morrison, there's a lot of depth in his storytelling, a lot of layers to it, and a lot of hidden meaning in his dialogue and in the writing and design of his storytelling. That couldn't be farther from the truth in Tom King's work, although I will give credit that we haven't seen this whole thing through, and I do want to kind of leave things open to this having a potentially more meaningful ending. It doesn't excuse the fact that even going over the 5 issues that have come so far out of this series, so little has happened, and what we have is lacking in key things. Most importantly, in telling an effective story. What I'm trying to say is that even if the last few issues of Heroes in Crisis are really good, it doesn't make up for the fact that the first 5 are so empty of content and meaning, and so boring because of that. Really remarkably bad in terms of how little there is to each of these characters. We have these opportunities that Tom King has forcibly created throughout this story in the form of these little 9-panel pages that populate the entire series. In these panels, the heroes get into their own psychology and talk about themselves, but it's always remarkably lacking every single time. Batman groans about how he's lost all his partners even though all of them are alive, which gets into the whole lack of any fundamental meaning to all these deaths that are being floated around. Like, I don't really care that Wally West and Roy Harper are quote-unquote dead, because I don't even know if it's going to last to the end of this storyline, let alone be a permanent thing, and it just leaves me feeling cynical. In that same issue with the Batman 9-panel thing, we also get the other two in the Trinity. Wonder Woman talks about how she used to have nightmares, but ultimately she got past them. She's glad that Sanctuary is here to treat heroes, but feels that the attention of mental health treatment is better focused on others. It's really boring, and I don't know why psycho-pirate stuff is still cropping up here. Tom King seems really into his own mythology at this point, but I'm not into any of this. Dealing with superheroes and mental health issues was a really promising idea, one that I think has a lot of potential. Getting into this stuff in an interesting way and actually dealing with this content in some depth would be interesting. But the story is completely lacking in that regard. And whether or not this is because Tom King was told not to go in that direction by editorial, much as that might have been the case with The Wedding from Batman's issues, is unclear, because although Tom King has very much said that all of this stuff is on him, he's a professional and he needs to be viewed as such. Which means, yes, he is going to toe the line. He's not going to sell his editors down the river if they make him change something along the way. And I think that's at least possible, given that the people in charge of DC Comics and the overall editorial branch of these comics are the same people that have made these mistakes in the past, running away from interesting issues and storylines, or even superheroes getting married and having families. And it all just gets to this blaring alarm that's been going off in the back of my head since we've started this Worst of 2018 list. And that's the fact that, in spite of Rebirth being great, it is worth remembering that the first year of the New 52 was pretty solid too, and the problems only really started to set in as the years went on. And more, looking at what's happened to Superman and Batman as characters, looking what's happened to those series that were once promising and awesome, gradually degrading into becoming what our viewers consider the worst of the year, and looking at the overall pattern and slant of what was on the best of list out of Marvel, and what was on the worst of list out of DC, there's a pretty clear pattern here, and a pretty clear slant in one direction over the other. DC certainly had a couple of things on the best of list, and Marvel certainly had a couple things on the worst of list, but the pattern is clear. DC was much more present, especially on the comic book side of things, on the worst of list. And I'm not happy about that in any meaningful way. Quite the opposite. If anything, if you've been following this channel over the past year and a half, you guys know that I really loved DC Rebirth and the direction it was going. But I haven't made any comments like that in some time because more and more we seem to be going in the wrong direction. And Heroes in Crisis seems like the perfect example of that. A potentially great writer like Tom King being dragged into the mud with these crossover events and failing to live up to even a basic standard level of expectations. Like, this comic wouldn't have to be perfect for me to at least appreciate some sides of it, but there's so little going on to it. Meanwhile, I haven't talked about the art yet, but this is not one of those situations where I just give the artist a pass and blame the writers for writing a terrible story and wasting talented artwork. Now don't get me wrong, Clayman is a talented, awesome artist, but I don't think he was the right choice for this series at all. In particular, there seems to be issues with keeping the tone of everything in some sort of coherent manner, and I'm sure a huge part of this is Tom King's writing, which weirdly alternates between a dead serious storyline about heroes dying and being horribly murdered in these strange circumstances, and weird, profoundly unfunny humor. This is where I really am reminded of those comparisons I made to Rian Johnson and Tom King in the Batman review a couple of videos ago. And this is where Clayman's artwork really isn't doing the Heroes in Crisis storyline any favors, because he has trouble adjusting to this tone. I don't think any artist could adequately bridge the two gaps we're talking about here, because the two things we're talking about here are fundamentally awful. But a different artist could have worked with this storyline more effectively. This is just a bad choice in editing, matching an artist and a writer together that at least for this story, aren't blending well together. Nowhere is that more apparent when we look at how Clayman is depicting Lois Lane, for example, is really sexualized, along with a lot of the other heroes, to be fair. And it just feels at odds with a very serious storytelling. Like, I'm not against it. It just seems weird that Lois is practically in a pin-up pose in this one page, in a story where heroes are being all horribly murdered. This happens a lot with a lot of different heroes and characters throughout this story, and that feels atonal to me in the same way the humor is. I really don't get the impression Clayman is being, like, chauvinistic with this or anything like that. I'm not saying it's an issue with having Lois Lane be sexy or having Harley Quinn be sexy. That stuff's fine. I really don't mind that stuff and would welcome it in the right context. And it's not always just in terms of sexualizing these characters. Putting them in comedic poses and saying and doing comedic things doesn't feel coherent and ultimately doesn't live up to the promises of its original marketing. And with that, we have finished the best and worst of 2018 as decided by you guys. Thanks for watching. It's been an interesting journey. I have mixed feelings about having split this thing into 20 parts and probably won't do it again like this. But, you know, it's all part of a learning experience, and I did enjoy aspects of that since it let me go into each individual entry in more detail. So let me know what you guys think if you have any suggestions. I'm thinking if we do something like this again, it'll probably be grouping the best and worst by each rank. So we do number 10 best and worst, number 9 best and worst, and so on and so forth. Thus creating only 10 videos instead of 20. And I somehow don't think anybody's going to object to us doing things like that more in the future. We aren't going to do all top 10s like this, by the way. Nobody's really complained about that or has been wondering across any of these videos as far as I know, so that's good. But the reason that I chose to do that to begin with was just because we had 2 top 10 lists that I wanted to go through at once, and I really didn't feel like making 2 giant long videos. That would be very boring for me and would lead to a drought in content in between these videos being made. Doing them in little bits like this felt like a little bit more fun. But don't worry, it's not going to be permanent, and it's certainly not going to be the case for every video going forward. Thanks again for watching, and if you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. This little series going through the best and worst stories of 2018 was the result of a Patreon poll after all. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics. Thank you.